relatively rare. Deception is quite widespread in animals, by the way, but it's not common. I've written a lot about pleasure. It's a great subject, and it's one that scientists really have overlooked. And I'd like to just summarize a few ways that animals get pleasure. Obviously, food is a great source of pleasure, and we should expect that, because if you don't eat food, you're not going to live. You're going to die. So we should expect that evolution should endow animals with a great motivation to find it and to consume it and to enjoy it. By the way, this is a runty pig named Clementine on a farm in Michigan that I photographed my mom feeding way back in 1977. And, you know, scientists would say, well, we don't know how that pig's feeling. True, we don't. But I think we can relate to that pig, and it does sort of suggest that there's probably some positive affect there. That kind of feels good and satisfying. As does this. And goats are an example of an animal who have a nice built-in back scratcher. And if you hang around goats long enough, sooner or later you'll see them, you know, scratching their back. It's just a nice way to relieve an itch. My daughter here, Emily, this is many years ago, but I volunteer regularly. She'll sometimes come with me to at a sanctuary for farmed animals near where I live in Maryland. And on a pretty chilly morning, we were both sticking our hands into the warm, fluffy, woolly backs of a couple of sheep, a couple of the more tamer ones. This is Hickory, and I had Clover in front of me. And it felt good, and I wasn't really thinking of it from the sheep's perspective. I should have been, back to my frog story. And I stopped, and I was talking to Emily, and suddenly I felt this scraping on my foot, and this sheep was actually, basically conveying to me, let's have more of that. If you hang out with dogs, and certain Oscar and Wrigley, is it? Wrigley? I mean, among those, and I just, it feels so good to rub them and grab their ears, and they love ear massage. If you don't know that, if you want to make friends with the dog, go for the ears, provided they trust you, but you really run those ears through your hands, they just sort of get floppy. And they ask you for more, they nuzzle, they come out, they can communicate. They've been manipulating us for 15,000 years. But anyway, it was really something to see a sheep behave in a sort of a similar way. And that the sheep knows, my interpretation partly is that knows that I'm an autonomous being who can make decisions and have actions that affect the sheep. And it's like, so the sheep asked me for more in a very straightforward way that I understood. So let's get a little bit about communication. Finish with the virtue now, which is an exciting new frontier in animal behavior. I mentioned how deception tends to be rare. Virtue tends to be common. Virtue is really a product of social living. When you live in a group, it behooves you to be considerate of others. If we went around being rude and slapping people and whatever, we'd simply be outcasts. We wouldn't have much of a social life. And that really has costs if you live in, especially in the wild, although in human society, I would say it also has major costs to you as an individual. So animals do show a lot of consideration and deference. Here's the bird equivalent of the previous slide. Here's a mammal, here's a bird. A couple of birds giving what's called allopreening, preening another. And you could put it in mathematical terms. This bird is buying a little credit with this one. So that, if I groom you now, maybe you'll remember that and give me a groom next week, or maybe something else. And indeed, that may be what's going on. But I like to mention in a talk I give about animal pleasure that's focused on that, and I'll just mention it here, is that scientists tend to think in terms of evolution, which is a great way to explain a lot of things, but there's also another E word, experience. And as far as I know, birds don't study up on Darwinian fitness and evolutionary theory. They do this because it feels nice, it feels good. It's nice to receive a massage, and interestingly, and we know this from ourselves, it's nice to give one too. That dog enjoys the ear rub, but I'm enjoying it as well. That nice ears. So it probably feels good to these guys to do this preening. Otherwise, why would they do it? Maybe they just know that they're going to get a favor back. That in itself is interesting. Studies with mice show that a mouse who can observe another mouse writhing in pain becomes much more sensitive to pain herself. When I say herself, because males do not show this empathic response. And mice only show that response if they know the other mouse is writhing in pain. It's not a very ethical study. I don't recommend it. It was done at McGill University some years ago. By the way, the same research team doing that now shown that they've developed a grimace scale. Mice actually show their pain in their faces, as do rats. So that's pretty mind-blowing, because we think, their stoicism is so important, not showing your emotions, and indeed that may be adapted, but if you look closely, you can actually see they're puffing up their mouths, they're squinting their eyes, the ears go back, and the whiskers come out. So these animals are feeling pain, and they do actually show it in their faces. Lastly, studies with dogs show that they have, and monkeys show they have a sort of a fairness awareness, or to use the jargon that scientists use, inequity aversion. They're averse to an imbalance in treatment. And the way it's done in this case, a couple of dogs who know to shake the paw. This, by the way, the study was done in Hungary. I always get a little humbled to see dogs who know Hungarian. I don't know any Hungarian, but they get these Hungarian commands and they understand. And if both dogs are offered a hand to shake the paw with, they're happy to do it, maybe 30 times in a row before they might maybe get a little tired of it. However, if you introduce treats so that one dog is getting a treat after each paw shake and the other dog is not, and you can tell who's been getting the treat here. This is after about 10 or 12 trials. This dog's ready for the next paw shake, it's like they're getting the treat. This one has not been given a treat. The paw shake, and he or she has had enough, and not offering the paw anymore. It happens a lot sooner. If both of them are getting treats, or if neither of them are getting treats, neither dog shows this sort of indignance or fairness awareness, or unfairness awareness, if you like. It's a very interesting finding. We can argue what it means emotionally, what is the animal actually feeling. But suffice to say, there's a difference in emotional affect. It's quite negative here, and this one's positive. One other example, just from a couple of studies published earlier this year, some very interesting findings involving chimpanzees, both of which I think relate to virtue. One certainly, and that is adoption behavior. A population in Africa, 18 wild adoptions of orphaned infants were documented by the research team. And intriguingly, 9 of the 18, the adopters were males. And chimpanzees are generally regarded as the males. They have sperm competition. It's a promiscuous mating society, and they mate with any female they can. And then that's it. They don't even know who's the father. So they generally it's viewed that they don't have much maternal care. There hadn't been too much evidence of that. And now we have evidence for adoption, which is a major investment of time and energy. We're talking not just days or weeks, but some months and years in some cases. And the other example was snare disarming. There's a population of chimps in maybe Basu Guinea who have taken to dismantling snares put out by poachers. They spend time working at them to try to make them so they're not lethal anymore. It's a very interesting finding in another primate. And studies show that the snare injuries, losses of hands, or other horrible injuries that they can suffer are significantly lower in this population, so it appears to be effective. It's tough to study because you just got to be in the right place at the right time, although I guess you could put out snares that are not actually harmful that look like snares and see if they do that, but I don't think they've done that. One can argue whether that's even ethical to do that. But anyway, very interesting behavior, and I learned recently some gorillas in the wild are now also dismantling snares. I hope that it's a cultural phenomenon that's passed on to other populations. It would be great. And in fact, I thought, maybe there should be training. We should have little seminars for chimps and gorillas and other animals, how to dismantle snares. They can learn that. They learn by observation. They watch what others are doing. And I think the ethical case can be made for doing that. A word that is such an important word that most people we don't hear this word sentience very much. The capacity to feel, in particular the capacity to feel pain and to feel pleasure. In my view, it's one of the most important words in the English language. And animals have it. We can argue where we draw the line on sentience, but wherever you draw it in pencil, because new information is continually coming out that gives us pause and makes us realize, well, maybe prawns are actually sensitive after all. But we know some animals, like cows, cattle here. This is little Whitaker who was rescued. He fell off a truck on the way to slaughter, I think, and or to a veal farm maybe, and ended up in one of the farm sanctuaries, so he's one of the lucky few. And they have keen senses, and they take in their world through their senses. And they have private moments that animals do. And they're individuals with preferences. I love what Tom Reagan said about animals. They don't just have a biology, they have a biography. And I like to say that sentience is the bedrock of ethics. The reason we have moral systems of good and bad, and rules and laws, is that other individuals have lives that matter, days that can go better or worse. And that's really significant. And if we recognize that other animals have that should affect how we interact with them. And this is a very sobering fact about animals. I won't read the slide, you can read. Other animals can feel pain or pleasure, for that matter, as intensely, and perhaps in some cases more intensely than we can. What does that say about how we maybe should be interacting with them? We need cultural change. Arthur Schopenhauer, the famous one of many German philosopher, said that change has 3 stages. Sorry, truth has 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed, then it is violently opposed, and third, it is accepted as self-evident. And I think probably the most significant change is how we wield this particular tool or weapon. And sometimes I speak at schools and I ask them, I say, what do you think is the most dangerous weapon in the world? And they give good answers: knives, guns, nuclear weapons, cigarettes, but they don't usually pick the table fork. And I think if you think about what we do with this fork, this tool, what we put in our mouths and how it may affect animals and also our own health, by extension of that, it's a very significant thing. And these words of Anne Frank speak to the power for social change, back to colonialism and the slave trade and the suffragist movement, the right to vote for women, and the civil rights movement. We can make great changes, and we do that by choice, by people making sensible choices or making ethical choices, by thinking about their actions and making a choice based on that. Every time we sit down at the restaurant or the dinner table, we do make a choice, and I'm focusing here on the diet issue, because the diet issue is the most important one in our relationship with animals. Of all the animals humans kill, of 100 for every 100 animals, 98% of them are killed to be eaten. And so if the human-animal relationship is going to improve, human eating habits really come first in terms of priority for making that change. When people think about choice and what they eat, often the defenses go up, and they think of reasons why they don't want to change their eating habits. And one of the ones, where do you get the protein? How can you be healthy on a vegan diet? But I'm not here to tell everyone to become a vegan. I think I regard veganism as the holy grail of personal activism for animals. But it isn't about perfection. People often think trying to be vegan is an act of perfection. There's no such thing. We make decisions and we try to minimize our negative impact on animals. And as living, breathing animals on the earth, it's not about eliminating animal suffering, because you can't do it. If you live and breathe and walk and get in a car, you're going to have negative effects. But we also have positive effects on others. And I think the positive effects can and should outweigh those. And so making your choice is really important. So if you eat meat, eat less often. We have this movement of meat-free Mondays. It's great. I mean, there are cities around the world that are adopting this, and it's becoming a thing. And the whole meat issue is becoming much more of a political thing. It's becoming more of an environmental thing. I read the Post regularly. I live in Washington, and 5 years ago, I had never seen an article that talked about environmental change and mentioned dietary choice, in particular meat consumption. And now I'm starting to see that mentioned a lot. It's becoming recognized as a huge factor. It's been known by those concerned about this for a long time that it's a huge factor, but now it's being recognized beyond the sort of the vegan clique and the vegetarian circles that many of us may live in. But it's not about perfection. If you eat meat, you eat less often. That makes a big positive contribution. Ideally, become vegetarian, because you're not sort of feeding that habit that tends to reinforce itself. So it may be easier just to go cold turkey. Sorry for one of a better expression. And if you're vegetarian, I recommend people go vegan, or even just try vegan. 30 days, a 30-day vegan challenge out there. Go without dairy products and eggs for 30 days. And if you want any motivation, just imagine taking the middleman out of the dairy industry. If you take the dairyman, the dairy farmer out, you basically have to go up to a cow, get on your hands and knees, and latch onto a teat and suck it. It's not a very natural kind of behavior. Europeans started drinking cow's milk about 7,000 years ago, so it's been going on in some cultures a long time. But it's we're the only species that does it. It's not a particularly normal way to nourish ourselves. It's a way that we took advantage of in our past, but it's one that we have so many options today, so many other ways to choose. To be the pig in the diner, although in this cartoon you may not be making the best choice that you think. The point is choice and the flexibility of doing that. And just in closing, I think, by choosing a more compassionate path, we're choosing a better world for animals, no question about that. But back to the synergy of the mutualisms, good and good, and virtue, and if you do good to others, it tends to be good to you. It's sort of a karma thing, that lovely concept of karma. If we do good to others, then it comes back to us. It'll be a better world for humans as well. And I think that's the world we all want. We all want that more compassionate world. And animals are a huge part of that equation, is that we're going to have a much better world when when we treat animals better. So every step in that direction is to the better, and I encourage you to take those steps and be part of that process. So enough said. Thanks very much for listening to me. I don't know if you want Q&A. Do you want people to have an opportunity to ask me questions? I kind of spoke for a whole hour there, I think, so you probably heard enough of me, but we can take a couple of questions if you have any. And if not, if you want to stretch your legs and get out, I'll be around, so just come up and ask me. Yeah.
When you talked about the rooster and the hen and how they have 30 vocalizations, is that the same sounds like at all different farms and different places?
Great question.
Like, is it a different culture?
First of all, 30 that we're aware of. They may have a bunch that we haven't really tuned into yet. I mean, they're chickens. They probably are aware of a lot more nuance in their communication system than we are. But I love your question. You know, if you go from one sanctuary to another, or one farm to another, is it the same call? And by the way, you know, go and study them in the wild. The red jungle fowl. That's what they come from. They're an Asian species, and they're still out there, albeit at a very reduced range. But I imagine if you went to different places, especially places that were geographically more disparate, you know, if you went and compared the calls at the sanctuary where I work at in Maryland and then went to Belgium and recorded some animals there, you may find some pretty fundamental differences. You'd see commonality in shared calls. Something I'm a very keen bird watcher, and bird watching really is more bird listening than watching. You mostly identify by sound, because a lot of the birds you don't see them, but once you get to know those calls, they're pretty distinctive. And the robin, the American robin here in North America, their equivalent is the blackbird in Europe. And they look so different because the blackbird's black, the robin is, you know, brown and lovely red breast. And yet, the way they move, the shape, they're in the same genus. They're so similar, and their voices are a lot similar too. They make very similar calls. But you can hear differences. And that's almost the same kind of thing. It's almost like they are different species, but they have clearly a shared origin. And yet, as the colors and the look has changed, so has the communication system that they have.
Yeah. With your travels abroad, Europe, and I think you mentioned Australia, the Europeans seem to be so far ahead of us in so many ways, health-wise, etc. Where are some of those countries in regards to understanding animals as being animals and sentient, being a sentient
As
being?
in, like, socially and culturally and understanding animals? Yeah, I don't really know the answer to that, because it's hard to get a feel for that when you visit a country. I think you really have to live there. I lived in England for a couple of years. I was born there, as Timothy mentioned, I think. But I lived there for 2 years in the 2000s. And it was the first time I really experienced the country, because I was 3 when I left. And when you stay for a couple of years, you get to know things you don't get to know when you're there for 3 weeks. I've had some visits before. You get to see the underbelly, the good and the bad, and the nuances and the subtleties of the culture, and the binge drinking and the vomit slicks on the sidewalk and some of this other stuff. If you read Notes from a Small Island by what's his name? I forget the author, but it's a great book about the English culture, and it's good and bad. Anyway, England historically has been very ahead of the curve. They've been ahead of the curve on animal issues. The vegetarian movement really sprung up there, although Indian Hindus have been vegetarian on religious grounds for a long time. But yeah, definitely, as you said in your question, I mean, legislatively, Europe is ahead of the U.S. And in some areas, the U.S. is a real laggard. I mean, it's the fact that we're the only country that still uses chimpanzees in great numbers. I mean, it's stopped in all the other countries, with the exception, I think, of Gabon or one of the African countries. Although I will say that the NIH announced a release to retirement of 110 chimps just a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, the U.S. is very strong in many areas. The number of laws that are passing, the number of state laws that are passing that are sort of animal protective have been increasing. There are regularly over 100 laws each year now passed. The Humane Society of the U.S. keeps track of that. But you also see some remarkably progressive laws happening elsewhere. The Council of Rome, whatever they're called, essentially the municipal board who passes city legislation in about 2006 or 5, passed a law that requires dogs to be walked a minimum number of times per day, and outlaws the keeping of goldfish in a goldfish bowl. Hard to enforce, but it sends a good message. Laws like that. And Switzerland passed a Gruppentier law a few years ago. Groupinter meaning group animals. And so animals who are regarded as social, that's a lot of species. There are a number of protections for them, including, once again, fish in tanks, social fish, including goldfish. You can't keep them alone, and you can't keep them in barren surroundings. And it involved also training in humane handling of fish for fishermen. I mean, you know, the cynics among us could say there's no such thing as humane fishing, but we can certainly do it less inhumane than is commonly done, using barbless hooks and handling the animals as possible, that sort of thing. So that was impressive. So humane training for fishermen, for anglers, and there was a few others in there. I think also dog law about dog walking, and then a number of times per day to walk them, and that sort of thing. So these are signs of change. Octopuses are protected by law in England, albeit only the common octopus, as if the other species probably don't share. They probably share the same kind of capacities that we should protect them. And new studies show that prawns feel pain. Prawns being essentially shrimp, crabs. Some pretty rigorous studies from Belfast, Ireland. So as the information I think I like to think it helps to drive as well as changes. But as far as sweeping cultural awareness, probably Europe is one of the strongest countries, and the U.S. in many ways is up there too. Maybe time for one more, if there is another one, or people have had enough. Just pack it in.
Well, I did have one. You know that paper you wrote, the laboratory routines cause animal stress?
Mm-hmm.
You know, when a researcher argues that they treat all the animals the same, so the only variability that's going to arise is from the research. I mean, I know that they're individuals, so each of them probably would have a slightly different stress reaction, but I mean, how do you dispel that, or how do you get them to consider those stress as a variable?
Sure, well, unfortunately the tradition has been in standardizing to try and treat everyone the same has been to simplify, to take away things that could be variable. Oh, give them toys, oh, that's going to be different, it's good, the toy's going to smell differently, or you're introducing variability in the environment, and that's going to be a confound. But ironically, there's a study that was published, I think, around 1990 in Science, which is arguably the most prestigious journal, and it was a very rigorous study done, and essentially concluded that by trying to control for all of these variables. Well, let's back up. I'll tell you briefly what they did. They took 3 labs around the world. One was in Europe, one was maybe Mexico, one in the U.S. and Canada, maybe 3 or 4 labs, but they were geographically disparate. But the mice were from the same source, the same breed, the same breeder, and they were shipped to these locations, and they had very, very clear, discrete instructions on how to treat the mice over the course of a few weeks, and then they measured a bunch of things in them, physiological measures, heart rate, body temperature on a given day. They did a bunch of measures over time. The idea was, the hypothesis is, can we get more fidelity? Can we get more predictability across populations if we treat them the same? And so it's really testing this question, the consistency, and controlling for all those variables. And their finding was, kind of like to the horror of the scientific community in a way, was that the results were absolutely disparate, couldn't be totally different, radically, hundreds of percentage points different in some cases. So really the take-home message of the paper is a very important paper, Crab et al. I remember the main author. It sort of debunks this idea that by controlling for all these variables we have scientific rigor, we have a very well-controlled experiment that eliminates all the noise in the system. It just doesn't work that way. And I think the main reason it probably doesn't work that way is because these animals are not living good lives. They're stressed, they're not normal, and psychological problems, stereotypies where they're digging for hours at night in the corner of their cages and gnawing at the bars, doing somersaults, and there's a bunch of behaviors they do that are very weird and abnormal. Their brains are stunted. There's studies that show that, measurably smaller brains in rats who were raised in impoverished environments. They're probably pessimistic like the starlings versus rats who live a more normal life and be more optimistic. All this stuff. It just makes the science very messy, and it makes it very hard to draw conclusions. And so the control thing really has been shown to not work. So if we do, while we're still using animals, and of course I look forward to the day when we're not using them in harmful invasive experiments. Not that we have to be agnostic and stop doing studies of animals, but nice studies that treat them with respect. But then while we're still using them in labs, let's give them a rich life. Give them stimulation, make them be more like mice and rats. And Yeah, there's challenges to that, but hey, you know, we create the challenge. We're the ones putting them in the cages, humans are. So I think the squirrels, I asked the squirrel to come by. Because, you know, I'm talking about rodents. We'll get your check in the mail. So anyway, that's my answer to that.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's time I think everyone got a chance to stretch their legs. I'm around if you have other questions, feel free to come up. I'm happy to sign a book if you like. And again, thanks for coming. Great event.